Chad. It's the center of Africa, in a sense. Not truly, as the Congo would probably be considered that. But the reason why it's considered the center of Africa is because it is exactly where all except one language group of Africans came from. Now, what is interesting is that genetic tests have been done on Chadic people and no extra traits have been found except new traits that came in the last 1,000 years, meaning Arabs who came in and fused with the people, or white people, French, or whatever. But for the longest time, they remained black Chadic people consistent with other tribes in Africa, from Sudanic people, Niger people, Pygmies, and so forth. That's the only group they're consistent with. Now, why this is a problem is because they're an Afro-Asiatic group, and part of the Afro-Asiatic language group, part of the theory is that it comes from Asia, but doesn't make sense in the sense because there is no real evidence for an Asiatic movement into Chad. Well, so what? Who cares if there is no movement? What does that say about the tribes of Africa back then? Well, here's what it says. Firstly, we know that this area is not wholly populated by the same tribes that it was back in the day. All the tribes that would have been in the middle have moved left and right from the center. So, in other words, people in Egypt, people in Nigeria, people in South Africa, people in North Africa, and East Africa would have descended from this one region. But two, we find in about 4000 BC, we find cattle being represented in the stone or cave art of people in Chad. And so, what do we do with this information, knowing that farming in Africa was already present in a place like Chad 4000 BC? We found that genetic diversity in Chad was broadly divided by a north south axis. The core ancestry of southern Chadians was Central African, most closely related to Pygmies. Southern Chadians then experienced four waves of gene flow over the last 3,000 years, and from West Central Africans, Eastern Africans, West Central Africans, and again, and then Arabians. In contrast, northern Chadians did not share Central African ancestry and were not influenced by the first wave of West Central Africans, but were influenced by Northern African ancestry. To explain that, that means at around about 2000 BC, do you start seeing all these other groups start to come in, and then ancestry from outside of Africa, like Arabs and all these other people, come in at the final end point. We performed supervised clustering individuals from the Chadian populations, 8 Sahelian populations, and 7 Sudanese and South Sudanese populations, and integrated these results with 2 additional Chadian populations and 2 populations of Chadic speakers. Broad trends conform to geographic expectations. Western and Central African ancestries were found predominantly in the West. Eastern African, Omotic, and Cushitic ancestries were found predominantly in the East. Northern African ancestry was found predominantly in the North, and Central African ancestry was found predominantly in the South. A combination of primarily Arabian, secondary Western Asian, and a low level of Southern Asian ancestries formed a gradient that decreased from the east to west. We found evidence for Southern European ancestry only in Arabians, Copts, and Nubians from Sudan. We found no evidence of Northern European ancestry. Chad, located in the center of North Africa, landlocked Chad, stretches from the Sahara Desert in the north to the savannah in the south. The country boasts thousands of rock engravings and paintings located in the two main areas, the Enendi Plateau and the Tibetsi Mountains. Both to the north, the depictions, the oldest of which date back to the 5th millennium BC, representing wild animals, cattle, and human figures, painting of highly detailed riders on camels and horses are especially numerous, as are groups of people around huts. Chadian rock art is particularly well known for its variety of local styles, and it includes some of the richest examples of Saharan rock art. The interesting patterns that we see that are shown on these rock art walls that look like dresses and whatever, but we can see that they're interpreted even on the people's heads. These patterns would go on to be consistent throughout the continent of Africa, and I've tried to show this before, but you can see them here in this rock art. The walls of the mountain range are literally scattered with thousands and thousands of paintings, the oldest being 8,000 years old, attesting to an intense and prolonged presence in prehistoric history. Even the superimposed of more recent images and older drawings, as well as some ancient images invisible to the eye but visible with modern de-stretch technology, which reveals a stylistic evolution over time. Now, what do I want to mention about this? Well, firstly, let's compare, since we already know that they started from this place and they went to other Afro-Asiatic regions to Arabia. Let's compare the ones that went eastwards. And let's see if we can see any similarities in the way that the evolution of the art went. So we'll look at two countries, Tanzania, Neolithic Tanzania, and then we'll look at Saudi Arabia. Now, given that we know that Afroasiatics come from the same place as Nilotics, here's the problem. We look at this photo from the, I think, Narjan area of Saudi Arabia, and they say it's a goddess Alia, but people don't really know. But you see the hair that's being depicted here of this woman, and they say clearly that's long hair, and it shows that this person has long hair, and she's just a long-haired Saudi Arabian. But if we look at Tanzania, and we know the Nilotics, because it's consistent with the other Nilotic works, we know that the Nilotics built this in Tanzania way before the Bantus got there, way before anybody else got there, and you can see that it's the hair is the same as these other people in this area. Now, quick question: what's more consistent, that the Afro-Asiatics fused with people who came from other regions of the world, as we saw in the other one when I talked about the genetics of the Saudi Arabians and how most of it is mixed with black people? Not the majority of it, but almost all Saudi Arabians have some black DNA? Or is it more consistent that the people who, North Africans who are the new ones, and Arabians mixed with them within the last 3,000 years, and these things date back way beyond 3,000 years ago? What's more consistent, that these are done by people who looked similar, or that they're done by people who look different? Or what's more consistent, that the people, the Arabs today, who look more like Sumerian paint, when you look at the Sumerian drawings, you can see that the people look like what Arabs look like today, that those people just came from Sumeria? Doesn't that make more sense? That if we look at Sumeria, we look at the people in Sumeria, they look a specific way, and the people today who we see in the Arabian areas, including the parts of Afro-Asiatic, they look like the Sumerian drawings. So they probably just came from Sumeria. So now let's talk about the backflow theory. The backflow theory is that
Arabs or whatever people went back into Africa thousands of years ago and formed these populations. We found that Y-DNA haplogroup R1b entered the Chadic gene pool during Bagarezacian or Bagara Arabs spoke Arabic, not Chadic, implying that people carrying R1BV88 were not responsible for the spread of Chadic languages, which may have spread approximately 3,700 years ago. We found no evidence for migration of Near Eastern farmers or any ancient episodes involving Eurasian backflow.
Now, let's revisit what we read earlier because I read it so fast I actually confused myself. The oldest of which date back to the 5th millennium BC, dash, represent wild animals, cattle, and human figures. Full stop. So, the rock art that is from 5000 BC represent wild animals, cattle, and human figures. This is why we can easily remove the idea that it's Western or Eurasian people coming in, but also through genetics, as those guys were doing, and also through linguistics, because the people who came in with Eurasian DNA are a more recent group. Even in North Africa, they're a more recent group, and they mainly came with Arabic. And when they say there's no backflow, they don't mean there's no backflow of some. They mean there's not even a backflow of North African, because that would come with the Eurasian DNA. That only happens later. Now, I want to state 100% that the Afro-Asiatic languages, the Bantu languages, and the other ones didn't come from directly the country of Chad, but the Chadic regions, which stretch from Nigeria. Like they said, one points to the east of Africa, the other points to the west of Africa, the other part of Chad points to the south, and those groups reflect the groups that would then speak those languages depending on which region they were in. You can see from the east that Chad is not that far away from the Nile. As you can see there, it's only a Sudanese hop away from the Nile, and then a Libyan hop away from Egypt. And of course, to the bottom, it's Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, by the way, is thought to be the center of Bantu languages, where the Bantu people disperse from. And of course, on the other side, West African languages. Then, of course, multiple movements, not necessarily into Chad, but Chadic regions. And these Chadic regions would spread this language. Of course, I've shown you the word ma, which means water, aman, which is both in Bantu and in the Northern African, that both means water in those two languages. And of course, there's Miri, Metzi, whatever, and there's the Ma version in Arabic. And these are different language groups that came from a similar local region. Now, whether this was borrowed back in the day or it was something that started with a common origin, that I'll never be able to tell you that. But I can tell you that there's a lot of similarities within these languages, which makes it obvious that they stemmed, at least at one point, from a similar thing. Follow the water. Is it odd or not odd that if you went to a Bantu speaker, a Nilotic speaker, or an Afroasiatic speaker, represented by these three groups? So, Bantu speakers, Southern African; Nilotics, Eastern Africans; um, Northern Africans, these are the Berbers. Is it odd? Is it weird? Does it strike anybody that if you went to any of these guys and you said the word Aman, that they would instantly understand that what you're talking about is water? Does that to you not ring as the same exact group? Or at least a borrowed word from the same group, and they've been separated from each other for thousands of years, except obviously in Chad where they became unified again. Does it not scare you? Does it not shock you? Does it not make you feel weird that all three of these people, if you went back to the past, as you can see that it's old Nubian. This is the Aman is the traditional word for water in Berber languages, and Amanzi, which you can see, I showed you the other version variations. There's Mai, which is water. There's Aman or Amai in the other versions. This is just the Zulu version. I'm trying to show you one crazy side of it, but you can see that they all of them. It's about Aman or Mai. Does it not scare you, shock you, move you that if you went to all three of these people, they would interpret this word as water when you said it? If you had a glass of water in your hand or a bowl of water, whatever you used back then, and you said Aman, they would be like, "Oh, water." And given these facts, is it fair to move away or ignore other similar words like the word Layla, nighttime, or Lail, sleep or nighttime in Arabic and other corresponding languages, Aramaic, Hebrew, and whatsoever, with the Akkadian Salalu, which means sleep, and then the Niger Bantu word Lala. So in Yoruba, La means to dream. In Igbo, Ura. In Akan, Da. In Bantu, to lie down or to sleep. In Cameroon is Ya. In Coast Bantu is Lala. In Shona is Rara. In South Africa, it's Lala. Swazi, Lala. Northern Ndebele, Lala. Southern Ndebele, Lala. Xhosa, Lala. Now, I could sit down here and go through hundreds of words of Afroasiatic and Bantu which have similar stuff. Like I showed you the other day, Indo was the Afroasiatic version, Semitic version of I. Ido was the other version. I think it was the Ethiopic version of the word I, and Ido was the Chadic version of the word I, and then Isho or Lisho is the Bantu word for the word I. But again, I could go through hundreds of these, but we don't have to because there's literally more than 100 Bantu languages. There's a whole ton of Afro-Asiatic languages, and there's a whole ton of Niger languages, or there's a whole ton of Nilotic languages, and we don't need to go through all of that. I've also showed you the Bai or Bait, which is house in all the languages, not one. I hate doing the thing of one language because I want to remove all chance of coincidence by showing that this applies in all the languages. There's some that only apply to one or two languages, but I leave that out because I know people are going to be skeptic. So I try to apply it to all the languages. So if this is a coincidence, it's four of a kind type of coincidence.